Hello everyone, today we talk about Aragonese Naples. I think, I could have talked, generally speaking, about Naples and Sicily together, because at this time, when we're talking about Aragonese Sicily, we're talking essentially from the 40s of the 15th century onwards, and especially since the Aragonese conquest of southern peninsular Italy that made up the Kingdom of Naples, although we will have to ratify it from a formal point of view, and basically you reunite the old Kingdom of Sicily, the one that had been founded by the Normans, um, together with the two crowns of Sicily and Naples. This sounds a bit complicated because when the original Kingdom of Sicily had been split between Naples and Sicily, both sides retained the title of Kingdom of Sicily. In Latin, the only difference was Regnum Siciliae Citrafarum and Regnum Siciliae Ultrafarum, which respectively meant the Kingdom of Sicily, before and before and beyond the Farum, which was basically the lighthouse of Messina. And the protagonist of this splitting had been the same Aragonese, because the Kingdom of Sicily at this time, we're talking about the 13th century, was as a whole, so southern peninsular Italy and Sicily, a unique kingdom that had been conquered by the Angevins. Now the Angevins had at this point the whole southern Italy, so the whole heritage of the Swabians and of the Normans in origin, in fact that they had taken away the kingdom from Manfred, who was the illegitimate son of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, and and had occupied the whole realm. Now the problem was, though, that the kingdom was had been hugely by that time had been hugely weakened by internal strife, instability, and also warfare with other political entities, including the same Angevins that eventually conquered it. So great part of the statal structures that had been built in a quite centralized fashion, by the way, by the Normans and by the Swabians, began to fall apart, and it was difficult to rule this kingdom at that point. And this weakness was exploited by the Aragonese. The Aragonese, by the second half of the 13th century, had still theoretically claims over the same Kingdom of Sicily, because they had intermarried with the Swabian dynasty, and they kind of, at that time, international politics was largely made on the juridical base of legitimacy, dynastic properties. So you couldn't really occupy a land that was not your own, that is in turn not have been inherited in some way, unless you hadn't been backed in a certain fashion, like for instance it had happened with Charles of Anjou, who conquered the Kingdom of Sicily because the Pope had called a crusade against Manfred of Hohenstaufen, and therefore winning with the arms the so let's say heretical, not the heretical kingdom, but the kingdom ruled by an heretic, a supposed an alleged heretic at least, who wasn't Manfred, would grant and especially the same papal support that was also not just ideological but also quite soundly monetary, was definitely the greatest help in that situation, but it was a kind of an exception. Although this exception wasn't so, so exceptional, in fact, for the Kingdom of Sicily in particular, because the other kingdoms of Europe kind of, followed their own dynastic development, sometimes very dramatically. Think about the Hundred Years' War. But the Kingdom of Sicily had a particular relation with the Pope, who, more than in other kingdoms of Europe, could intervene to set political matters, because essentially, in origin, the Kingdom of Sicily had been technically allowed as a political construction by the same Pope to the Normans, and it was always considered as a kind of a feudal property of the papacy, in the sense that the Normans, for obtaining the crown of Sicily, had to declare themselves vassals of the Pope. And this is actually a long story, because even before the Normans, there was all preceding, previous reasons for this that are too complicated now, that are related to explain, that are related to the great amount of papal estates into Sicily before the Arab conquests. So the proximity to Rome, of southern Italy was always felt by the popes as a channel through which several political options were viable. So whoever set foot in the Kingdom of Sicily as a ruler had to cope at least with papal benevolence in many ways. We will see that also for the Aragonese in this context. The Aragonese had seized Sicily at an early age, in the second half of the 13th century, through the famous Sicilian Vespers. Basically, the Vulgata basically is that the Sicilians got tired of the Angevins who molested women and stuff, but things are a bit more complex. Sicily was indeed a weak ground for the Angevins, who in fact had shifted the original capital of Palermo in Sicily to Naples, so on mainland Italy, and deciding that to be the center of the kingdom. So obviously Sicily was also far geographically from relatively at least from Naples, and it was, that also meant for the technologies and the communications of those times that it could more easily rise, and plus there wasn't really a great and deep Angevin routing into Sicily. So what happened is that the Aragonese, together with the Byzantines, decided to make the Sicily revolt, or at least the Sicilians kind of got allied with these powers. The Byzantines at that time weren't even, they were the leftovers of the Byzantine Empire that had been conquered by, not surprisingly, the French. So a series of noblemen were close politically to the House of Anjou that had conquered the Kingdom of Sicily, and and obviously making Sicily revolt in that context would have meant to weaken considerably the Angevin expansion into the Mediterranean, which seemed definitely, especially with the relative, at least at that point, wealth of Sicily, unavoidable in many ways. So basically Sicily revolted, and an Aragonese army seized it. The Angevins were kicked out beyond the Strait of Messina, and basically from this point of the second half of the 13th century we have Aragonese Sicily and Angevin Naples. as I was saying before, both sides wanted to claim the legitimacy over their over the Sicilian crown. So technically, they created two separate kingdoms, one on its own, on its own. Excuse me. That was called Kingdom of Sicily, and even the same Aragonese and the Angevins during the treaty, all the treaties that they signed between a war and another were kind of backing each other in this sense, meaning that they didn't say that that part of the Kingdom of Sicily belonging to their enemy wasn't the Kingdom of Sicily, because that would have meant even to delegitimize the original bloc as a whole, and they kind of recognized, diplomatically speaking, the title of rulers, at least of that part of the Kingdom of Sicily, on their own. Now, it's a pretty dark history. There was a lot of war between the Aragonese and the Angevins. In the first period in the 14th century, the Angevins used a very big quantity of resources to try to get Sicily back from the Aragonese, but everything failed. There were a lot of fights in not just in land but also on sea, because some of the most advanced naval warfare in Europe at that time occurred, in fact, in the Mediterranean, because of the especially the involvement of the Italian maritime republics into the policy, the politics of these southern Italian kingdoms. Also because practically, especially the Angevins, didn't really have a fleet on their own. They kind of were supported usually by the Genoese fleet, and the Aragonese and Venetians fighting against them for many strategical reasons that now, they're kind of perceivable, and they can be understood given the various positions of the respective powers. But this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is when, in the 15th century, Alfonso of Aragon managed to conquer the the extremely weak Angevin kingdom that had gone steadily declining, especially for dynastic reasons, during the 14th and the first half of the 15th century. And it's very interesting that in this sense things had gone better into Aragonese Sicily from a statual point of view than into Angevin Naples. So there were, between the 14th and 15th century, two rather different and comparable evolutions of the two respective kingdoms. And things were going worse in Naples. And it was always a matter of keeping essentially the local barons down. The barons were essentially the aristocracy of the original Sicilian kingdoms. They originated as a name from the ancient Norman barons that were installed by the same Normans with French vassals, or sometimes were even, especially in southern Italy, and this is in mainland Italy, so the Neapolitan part, let's say, drawn from local aristocracy at some point, to a certain extent. I mean, the Normans installed their own vassals kind of everywhere, especially in Sicily and Apulia, but there were other regions especially of southern peninsular Italy that were more tied to the older aristocracy that had survived, especially in the Apennines. And these were communities that also had a very different cultural, even linguistical, and especially juridical difference compared to the Sicilians, to Normans especially, because there were basically no Sicilians at that point. Sicily had, I mean, no Sicilian aristocracy before the Norman conquest survived in the sense that there were the Arabs were wiped away, and the Normans installed in Sicily only Norman vassals, basically. In southern peninsular Italy, things instead had been a bit different, because there were already powerful aristocracies that had survived the same Norman conquests, and at a certain point had even triggered it and obliged themselves to follow it. And therefore, the situations were different ab origine in many ways. So the local barons had greatly exploited the wars and the dynastic struggles that had occurred into Naples, which means that basically they had expanded their own prerogatives into the feudal system during this period, and the new sovereigns that had arrived there, the Angevins and the Aragonese eventually, were too weak, even as invaders, they were strong enough to kick out the ruling dynasties that were there at that point, but they weren't so strong to counter the power of the local aristocracy, of the barons. And especially in Naples, the barons had gained a huge power, and this was all obviously something negative for the strength of the new crowns that were created. So the problem with the Aragonese government of Naples was that at all times the crown had to interact and to cope with this baronal class that was, as we have said, quite powerful, and that wasn't very happy about a sovereign coming there and basically starting to build or to centralize the kingdom at their own expenses substantially. So this is a process that you can better see into the modern age, where into which the centralized states were being formed by expanding over the old leading feudal aristocracy. And the case of Naples especially is very important, especially during the modern age, because it's the case of a relatively wealthy place, but at a time that could have really backed the development of a centralized monarchy, but because of the huge power that the barons kept having, basically, and especially during the Age of Enlightenment, the main reforms of a centralized monarchy were aborted by the opposition of the local nobles, and this, by the way, brought into the 19th century to the steady decline of the Kingdom of Sicily, that was eventually wiped out relatively easily by the Italians, by the Piedmontese, better, with English support, etc., because it was at that point so weak that even the same establishment recognized that it was more profitable to enter in a more advanced system like the one that Savoy had managed to expand to the rest of Italy, and that in which, by the way, certain behaviors and bad habits could flourish. Part of the reason why mafia exists, for instance, is due exactly to is strictly related to the fate of the medieval Kingdom of Sicily in this sense, and the Aragonese government produced some results in the opposite sense. The whole thing could still be saved, but at the same time didn't wipe the barons out, and probably they didn't have even the strength to do so at that time. and the obviously the strong development of the aristocratic forces obliged the Aragonese kings to grant concessions and privileges to the barons, and it was this was the exactly the same reason for which the same monarchic power couldn't prevail steadily over the baronial one. And at this time, the situation was kind of normal for medieval standards, in the sense that the most jarring element of this is that technically southern Italy had a huge economical potential that was revealed by some of the same Aragonese economical policies in the kingdom. Um, and it was still a force to be reckoned with. I mean, even compared to the the economically more dynamic Italian states of of central and northern Italy, especially when Sicily and Naples were reunified, the Aragonese vice crown that was established in southern Italy was also had a very strong military, could influence European politics. This is the time in which, for instance, Charles of Burgundy strongly had contacts with the Aragonese. There was a political game going on between the major powers of Europe, and definitely the one of Sicily was one of them. And let's not forget that the Aragonese also, like their predecessors, the Angevins, the Swabians, and the Normans, theoretically, although being the weakest that in in this perspective of steady decline in the passage from a dynasty to another, still technically thought it was possible to carry out a Mediterranean policy that even at a point involved the idea of seizing Constantinople, which was the fixed ambition that every other sovereign of Sicily had since the beginning. Even if the Aragonese were the ones who went the shortest to reach. And from another side, there is also the consideration that the Neapolitan barons weren't really the only class existing in southern peninsular Italy, meaning that there were other classes and organisms that most of the times didn't like the baronial power either, so maybe they could have found an ally into the king, and would definitely in part, and these were the so-called citizen universitates. That was basically the cities as a whole. In the Middle Ages, the term universitas in Latin, university, in fact, that's the same word, was a term used to define every kind of social organization. So that's the reason why universities call themselves in this fashion. But at that time, the universitas was kind of every social group. It's as if now every group you belong to on social networks was called universitas. It would also fit, telling the truth, in today's language in many ways, because basically meant that that there was a group that was aimed towards the same direction. So, but the problem with and these cities of the Neapolitan kingdom were kind of developed for that time, but they didn't have hope to counter nobility, they had been too weakened. And yeah, southern Italian cities were kind of developed, especially demographically speaking, for that time. But we should also say that the Kingdom of Sicily was born and eventually remained as a feudal kingdom, differently from the regional, the Italian regional states that were being built in the center and in the north, who were essentially merchant republics that had grown from a city usually, and had a relatively centralized conception of their statual forms. The Sicilian kingdom was a very feudal land, but paradoxically, the cities had so much potential that not even the feudal expansion could choke them completely. So there was some activity and development into these cities. However, they were not given a political role into the clash between the Aragonese and the Neapolitan barons, and they managed only to get into the process just very exiguous margins of self-government that were already something, but they wouldn't have the strength to expand into the countryside and to have the strength to fight barons and stuff like that. The northern Italians had made it instead, and they had won over feudalism in some ways, or at least they kind of managed to integrate it into their systems from a position of force over them. In the south, this hadn't been possible, which is interesting because the first maritime republics, the maritime republics of Italy, weren't really the one of the north that had surely an ancient development, but kind of came slightly later. Some of the, like Amalfi, for instance, in southern Italy, Amalfi is usually remembered like the first maritime republic for saying that southern Italy, without the feudal system imported by the Normans, technically had the chances to expand. But it was, it was wiped away by the imposition of the feudal state. That, however, in the southern kingdom was definitely a very successful one, because the Normans had managed originally to create basically by those times the most powerful and most centralized kingdom of Europe. A few people know that, but so it is. At this point, instead, as we see, the internal power wasn't very much in favor of the centralized government, but all the contrary. So the potential of the expansion potential of the southern kingdom was stamped, was hampered by the barons, who owned their own great power, as we will be seeing. By the way, another element that can give you the dimension of how serious this phenomenon was is that during the 14th and 15th century, within the same Neapolitan kingdom, there were certain powers that had emerged from the feudality, from the feudal system, that were the Duchy of Calabria, so Calabria being the point of the boot of Italy, and the princedom or principality of Taranto being instead at the base of the heel of the boot of Italy, and these two entities were obviously framed within the feudal hierarchy of the Aragonese kingdom. However, they were quite autonomous, if not independent in some ways, and well through the early modern age, they remained a sort of autonomous force that sometimes could even or against the decentralized direction of given by from Naples. So for considering the administrative system of Aragonese Naples, within the borders of the kingdom there were certain districts that actually were created by the Swabians back in the day and had kept being used by the Swabian by the Angevins, so that the Aragonese eventually inherited them. That were I don't know how you wanna translate that. It would be the Justiciaries. Yeah, this would be anglicizing it, which were in turn were districts administered by public officers called the Justiciaries. I think this is it would be, in English there is the word avenger, for as far as I know, but the avenger is someone who is basically avenging, so not necessarily making justice. Here the etymology is the justiciaries, the ones who carry out justice. So they were strictly administrative office with obviously juridical powers, and being public officials, this meant that they were they were named by the same king, and they kind of had more than just judiciary power, because they were entrusted also the military and financial administration of the local district. And obviously they also had a retinue of other, helpers and sub-officers that subordinated to them, that had in turn entrusted the administration of minor districts within the bigger judiciary. So obviously these offices corresponded to an attempt of centralization of some sort that could back the private rule of the local lords. This is something you can find literally from the early Middle Ages. I get very upset when I see and I hear people saying that a centralized thought was carried out just during the modern age, because telling the truth, these were the same force. The idea of having a public officer that is sent into a district to administrate justice is essentially, the same in the Middle Ages as well as in the modern age. There is nothing really changing with that. Just the difference is just that in the modern age there was a greater capability of centralization, but this is something that always existed in some measure, even during the Middle Ages. And the Norman kingdom and the Kingdom of Sicily had been theoretically at this point, but practically also in Norman times, the one who had the most highly centralized administrative system of Europe. And there was even a law unique, as far as I know, in the whole medieval and modern juridical systems in Europe, that the Sicilian king, or the Neapolitan king, however you want to call it, could basically create law on its own, which means that the old and standard theory for which the king was king because he was entrusted power, like any other feudal authority, to defend the rights of the local communities. So the pre-existing traditions that pre-existed the same feudal power was surpassed, because in here it was said basically that that God had a particular relationship with the sovereign, and he could theoretically, especially where the local rights were kind of lacking an answer for a certain legal case, he could judge the situation, or even making a new law and imposing it on the whole realm as a king to be obeyed. So this is quite meaningful. Even, I repeat, at the time of the Aragonese, it was kind of utopistic, utopistic, I'd say in English, given the situation. And however, so you see that there was a lot of continuity into Aragonese Naples from the previous political and juridical traditions. However, the Aragonese managed to do also something new when they arrived on the Neapolitan throne. Basically, they instituted a new figure that was the one of the vice realms, that basically renewed the previous districtual organization. So there were vice kings who were, as the name obviously hints at, were the local representatives of the sovereign, and they exercised over the Neapolitan territory a major political authority compared to the one of the pre-existing justiciaries, and these vice kings even managed in certain occasions to deprive the Neapolitan barons of some prerogatives that they had acquired over time. So as you understand, the barons, being a private entities in many ways, weren't much of they didn't have a standard power. So it was perfectly plausible in certain occasions for these Aragonese vice kings to achieve something against certain barons. Maybe accomplice the support of other jealous barons, maybe wanted to see a rival weakened or redimensioned in his ambitions, but it wasn't really great news for the baronial class as a whole. At the same time, the idea of the vice king is something that basically was instituted in southern Italy by the Aragonese because of the composite nature of the Aragonese domains, because obviously it's not that the Aragonese took their home into southern Italy. The Aragonese ruled from Aragon, so southern Italy was still relatively far away from their home, and the Kingdom of Aragon was usually maybe back in Spain most of the time. So the idea of the vice realms was an institution also dictated by the simple obvious a realization that the Aragonese kings couldn't be in southern Italy all the times. So maybe these vice kings could have an increased power compared to the previous Sicilian administration, but they were still kind of vice kings. And as you know, the Aragonese kingdom of southern Italy was eventually eventually kind of flowed into the bigger Spanish monarchy that came from the unification of Castile and Aragon in the second half of the 15th century, and that made all these huge territories of the most of the Iberian Peninsula and southern Italy a whole, theoretically at least a whole kingdom. I say theoretically because, telling the truth, the unification of Spain wasn't really an administrative unification. Castile and Aragon, even after the dynasty of the Trastamara basically started to rule into Spain, and after the Habsburgs came, was still made up of the separate crowns of Castile and Aragon, who had very different traditions, by the way. So this kind of increased the problem of having a collection of personal domains that increased even when it was the Habsburgs that had to rule that. Think about Charles V, a man who had southern Italy, the Duchy of Milan, Spain, the Austrian lands, the Flanders, and the Americas. So huge territories that implied necessarily some form of, at least they implied that the king couldn't be everywhere in the same place. So the idea of vice kings into these lands came in the lands of southern Italy specifically that we're talking about now, came to be the standard of the Sicilian lands. And as a matter of fact, until the Italian unification, the kingdom of the two Sicilies was in fact a vice kingdom. It was never a kingdom on its own, a detached kingdom from Spain. No, it still obeyed to, generally speaking, to the authority of someone else, and being part of a greater game that really didn't make this kingdom very autonomous in its choices, which is very important politically speaking, because one thing is being a king who lives in its own kingdom and that he has only one kingdom. Think about the Normans. The Normans had created the kingdom into Sicily. That was their kingdom, and obviously that was all they had, so they would try to expand it because that was their only kingdom. Another thing is to have a kingdom in one place and one in another, and being concentrated in a war on a very far away strategical theater. Well, most of your domains will be left without an autonomous guide that can strengthen singularly through the strengthening of their own local interests. So there is a kind of passivity that progressively increases into the autonomous into the political autonomy of this kingdom of Sicily, that probably explains also in here the concept of how mafia was born, because at that time, telling the truth, was all alike in every feudal society. But what happened in Spanish Naples is basically that there were Spanish rulers who could rule such a developed place like Italy just through cooperating and kind of supporting the privileges of the local barons. So this means that there was an increase of the weakening of the central authority and a kind of mobster attitude of the local nobility, who had all the interest to, for instance, to dominate over the cities, to take money out of trade and stuff like that. And there were certain revolts even in modern in the modern Neapolitan kingdom, because there were certain more dynamic classes that wanted to expand on their own, and still and yet they were choked by the Spanish and Neapolitan the Spanish vice kings and Neapolitan barons. Obviously, these emerging classes weren't little angels as well. You know, they were kind of mobsters their own way. Not surprisingly, they mostly developed into the most in the areas where there were more traffics, etc. But let's say that the whole picture was not good for the general health of the kingdom. However, the worst problem in the government of the Aragonese kingdom was the very dangerous revolt of the barons that occurred in 1485. The causes of the baronial revolt are quite evident. It's basically what we have been talking about up to now. So it was a kind of, you know, attempt of the barons to even kick away the same Aragonese monarchy at a point. And this was a very resounding event, not just for Aragon and her domains, but also for the political balance of the Italian of the Italian system as a whole, of the so-called Peace of Lodi, which is a city in northern Italy, that had been signed in 1454, and that is normally conceived as the freezing of the immediately pre-existing political situation in Italy, that came out for essentially the fact that the Italians had been slaughtering themselves for the last 2 centuries at least, and that all effort at that point was seen as pointless, and especially through the diplomatical genius of Lorenzo de' Medici, so the Florentine lord. The Italians basically said, okay, let's stop here and let's create a system into which we don't make any more war, and everyone who tries to seize someone else's property has to be fought by all the others conjuncted. Now, the Peace of Lodi, the system inaugurated by the Peace of Lodi, actually held until the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, famously in 1492, the same day of the same year in which Columbus discovered, let's say, or better arrived to the Americas, and especially with in 1494, that is the beginning of the Italian Wars, the so-called Italian Wars, that corresponds to the invasion of the southern Aragonese kingdom, or Spanish at that time kingdom, by Charles VIII of France, who in turn was invading the kingdom because he said that it belonged to him because of the Angevin legacy of the French kings and all, you know, these endless problems that, as you understand, were part of a much broader and interconnected system, into which especially the balance of the Italian lordships was extremely important. So the rebellion of the Neapolitan barons broke out in November 1485, and it was characterized by the participation of some of the most authoritative and representative exponents of the Neapolitan nobility. We are talking about the Prince of Salerno, Antonello Sanseverino, the Count of Sarno, Francesco Coppola, and to them was also cited a figure that was, telling the truth, very close to the Aragonese crown itself. That was the royal secretary Antonello Petrucci. So we're talking about very big names that kind of struck directly at the heart of the Aragonese power in Naples. So these barons also had in this process obviously many political ties. Firstly, they managed to bring to their side the Pope Innocent VIII, and to even get some backing from Venice. So obviously papal politics at this point was quite complex. Evidently there were problems which that would bring the Pope to side with rebels, and Venice also always looked at at the Kingdom of Sicily, telling the truth, because the major problem of Venice was to pass through the Strait of Otranto, that is between Apulia and Albania and the Balkans. So the problem of a strong southern monarchy for Venice was that it technically could close the Adriatic Strait, and that they couldn't pass into the east, where they had all their properties scattered all over the eastern Mediterranean. So Venice always kind of played in behind the curtains to create instability into southern Italy. The Phoenicians being quite clever indeed. So at this point the situation was saved. And this is fascinating, by an external figure that we already recalled, where there was Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, the guy who embodied in this sense the equilibrium of Italian politics at this time through his very wealthy Florentine banks. That was the main reason why he could afford such such interventions, but also because he was actually a diplomatic genius in many ways, an extraordinary man. I still haven't talked about Lorenzo de' Medici in my videos. I will have to. And there was also the engagement of other powers like the Sforza, who were conservative relatively to the peace of Lodi system at that time, and that pushed for the Treaty of Peace that eventually arrived in 1486. So it was a very intense affair, but it could really mess up the whole situation. So this peace treaty basically obliged the Aragonese king Ferrante to regulate a tribute to the church, as a condition to set things right with Rome, and to reinstate the old tradition of vassalage that tied the Sicilian kingdom to Rome. And at the same time, the forgiveness of the rebels, which obviously was a much harder choice. And this was carried out, although the Ferrante of Aragon signed the treaty, but immediately after having signed it, Ferrante made an extremely bloody vendetta against the barons, and especially he had immediately executed Antonello Petrucci together with his sons, and also the Count of Sarno basically lost his life. So like this is like the Sicilian, or better Neapolitan at this point, drama, of bloodshed, intrigue, and so on. But it kind of tells you, we are in full Renaissance Europe, and there is a kind of, obviously, of ruthlessness of political affairs and how, these were dealt with. Um, but the revolt of the barons, in this sense, also allowed the Aragonese kings to, to wipe out certain amount of opposers, and this also strengthened the church, as we've seen, because Ferrante was obliged to pay a tribute to the Pope, who was also, as everyone, quite happy of having new monies in his treasure, and yeah, things would evolve, and yeah, and in another circumstance, we'll be talking about how instead Sicily proper had developed under the Aragonese, and it's a longer story because it begins earlier in time, so there is more to say, or at least something to add up that can even be useful as a comparison. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or or subscribe to my channel. I'm not growing very much, so kind of I'm not depressed, but I wish things fared better for the channel. But I can't pretend, appreciation if I don't do something that people care about. So, anyhow, as always, I thank you for listening, and I wish you a beautiful time, as always, and see you next time. Bye.